Blood and power. These two driving forces shaped the entire reign of Henry VIII. As his bloated body decayed from within during the final cold days of 1547, England's most infamous monarch confronted his mortality with the same cold cunning that had led him to send 2 wives and countless foes to their deaths. "The lion is dying," whispered the courtiers in hushed tones, yet his claws remained poised to strike until his final breath. The path to this horrifying end had its origins decades earlier in the life of a dashing, athletic prince celebrated across Europe for his vitality and magnetism. What caused this Renaissance icon to become the tormented despot gasping for air in the dimly lit rooms of Whitehall Palace? The truth lies not only in the tales of his notorious marriages, but in a succession of medical disasters that would gradually distort both his physical form and mental state beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry bore little resemblance to the spirited man who had once competed alongside the best knights in Christendom. His body had become a canvas of suffering. His legs were covered in suppurating ulcers that emitted such a revolting stench that courtiers struggled to remain in his presence without retching. Henry now required mechanical contraptions to transport his immense frame, which some reports claimed had swelled to nearly 400 pounds. Its previously attractive face was now bloated and misshapen, with sunken eyes and skin that had taken on a jaundiced hue. The royal doctors had exhausted every option in their limited medical toolkit. Bloodletting, herbal tonics, and fervent prayers all failed to halt the relentless assault of illnesses plaguing their sovereign. Most contemporary scholars agree Henry likely endured type 2, diabetes, gout, and perhaps osteomyelitis, a severe bone infection that may explain the constant torment in his legs. Even more alarming was the king's unraveling mental state. His once famous temper had evolved into uncontrollable fits of rage, broken by spells of lethargic confusion. And even as death crept closer, political concerns about the line of succession dominated the court. His third queen, Jane Seymour, had at last borne him a male successor, the delicate 9-year-old Edward, but rival factions were already vying for dominance over the young prince after Henry's demise. The Catholic conservatives, led by the Duke of Norfolk, clashed with the reformist Protestant camp, led by Edward Seymour, the prince's uncle. Henry, suspicious until the end, remained keenly alert to these conspiracies, signing death warrants even while struggling to hold a quill. The king's rapidly failing health was one of the court's most closely protected secrets. Official proclamations continued to present him as strong and vigorous, while the reality painted a far bleaker picture. Those granted access to the royal sick room were met with a grim spectacle, the massive bed draped in heavy dark fabrics, the cloying odor of decay only partially masked by smoldering incense, and at its center, the immense suffering figure of a man who had once been England's paragon of strength. Palace staff whispered of the king's agonized cries echoing through Whitehall's cold stone corridors. The ulcers on his legs inflicted such unrelenting pain that even slight movements caused spasms of suffering. Physicians applied poultices made of everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate measures that only worsened his agony. More effective was the generous use of opium, which dulled his pain but clouded his already failing mind. The psychological anguish mirrored the physical. Henry, once the most dreaded figure in the kingdom, whose word meant life or death, now found himself powerless in the face of his own body's betrayal. Records from the court point to increasingly unhinged behavior, bouts of near delirium in which he muttered to unseen specters of executed enemies or called out the names of long-dead wives. In moments of clarity, he became obsessed with reworking his will, striving to steer his legacy from beyond the grave. Observers were troubled by how erratically the king swung between spiritual stances in these final days. Though he had broken from Rome to claim the Church of England as his own, he now seemed plagued by religious uncertainty. One day he would demand Catholic rights, the next, he would endorse Protestant teachings. His chaplain recounted how Henry woke in panic from nightmares, claiming to see the faces of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, and other victims of his reign standing silently at his bedside in judgment. The looming death of the king created a perilous vacuum of power that his courtiers scrambled to fill. The Privy Council splintered into warring camps, each racing to secure influence in the anticipated regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who had skillfully survived countless intrigues at court, was finally outflanked by the Protestant bloc. In a final act of Henry's enduring brutality, Norfolk was condemned to die for treason by order of the fading monarch, though he would ultimately escape the axe as Henry passed away before the sentence could be executed. On January 27, 1547, Henry's health took a dramatic and final turn for the worse. Eyewitnesses claimed he suffered a violent seizure so intense that attendants had to physically restrain him to prevent injury. Once the seizure subsided, he struggled to speak. The right side of his body rendered immobile. Modern experts interpret this as evidence of a catastrophic stroke. The royal doctors, aware that failure might mean their own ruin or death, battled desperately to resuscitate the king, scorching his skin with hot irons and forcing down bitter draughts of medicine. During this crisis, entry to Henry's bedchamber was tightly restricted by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Henry's most trusted counselor. Such secrecy served purposes beyond mere decorum. Rumors of the king's impending death could incite premature power plays or even provoke foreign aggression. Cranmer ensured that only essential personnel were allowed in and swore them to strict silence about the king's true state. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and surviving wife, was barred at times from the chamber during critical moments. As January gave way to February, the king drifted in and out of consciousness. During his brief lucid intervals, Henry appeared increasingly terrified of divine judgment. The man who had ordered the executions of wives, nobles, and commoners alike now approached his own end with growing dread. One servant's journal recounts hearing the king whispering prayers and pleading for forgiveness in his sleep, a haunting contrast to the iron-willed autocrat who had once bent England's religious order to his command. Royal documents detail the extraordinary efforts taken to maintain a semblance of dignity for the king in his final days. As his body deteriorated, teams of attendants worked around the clock to perform the increasingly grim duties of cleaning and shifting his colossal frame. The leg ulcers had worsened to such a degree that exposed bone was reportedly visible through the decaying flesh. The odor was so overpowering that perfumed handkerchiefs became standard for anyone entering the room, and the windows were frequently thrown open, despite the winter chill, whenever the king lost consciousness. By February 27th, it became impossible for those at court to maintain the fiction that Henry might recover. Archbishop Cranmer was urgently called to the bedside as Henry's breathing grew more labored. Historical accounts describe how, unable to speak, the king was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he trusted in Christ rather than relying on rituals of old. Henry is said to have squeezed his hand with what strength remained before slipping into his final coma. This moment is often cited by Protestant chroniclers as proof of a last-minute turn toward Reformed faith. Henry died before dawn on January 28, 1547. Even in death, his immense body dominated the royal chamber, a grotesque reminder of his years of excess and decline. The official record stated the cause of death as natural decay, though modern interpretations point to a fatal combination of cardiac failure, systemic infection from his wounds, and complications from probable type 2 diabetes. What followed his death was even more remarkable, a carefully orchestrated silence by the Privy Council, which concealed the news for 3 days to secure the succession for young Edward VI. This delay was instrumental in ensuring a stable handover of authority. While Henry's body lay cooling in Whitehall, Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, acted swiftly and decisively to consolidate power. He held secret councils, secured military strongholds, and neutralized rivals, all before the public was informed of the king's passing on January 31st. By the time the bells tolled in London to announce the monarch's death, Edward Seymour had already secured his position as Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, becoming the de facto ruler of England. Handling Henry's remains posed unique difficulties, shedding light on both Tudor funerary customs and the king's condition at the time of death. Historical records indicate that the royal body began to decay rapidly, likely a result of the severe infections already raging within him. Embalmers worked urgently, removing the internal organs and filling the body with aromatic herbs and preservatives. Even these seasoned experts were reportedly horrified by what they found, particularly the diseased liver and greatly enlarged heart. A specially constructed coffin was required to accommodate Henry's immense size, reportedly nearly double the width of a standard noble's casket. Its sheer weight demanded a reinforced bier and extra pallbearers to carry it. During the lying in state at Whitehall, onlookers reported that the lead-lined coffin ruptured under pressure from the gases produced by decomposition, allowing bodily fluids to seep onto the chapel floor. This gruesome detail was quickly hushed up, though some accounts claim that dogs were seen licking at the leaked fluids, an undignified final moment for a man obsessed with regal image. The funeral procession to Windsor Castle on February 16th gave the Tudor regime a final chance to assert Henry's authority posthumously. Horses draped in black pulled the massive coffin through crowds of mourners, while effigies showed Henry as he had once appeared in his prime, rather than the grotesque form hidden within the casket. At St. George's Chapel, Windsor, Henry was interred beside Jane Seymour, the only one of his 6 wives to bear him a son, and the only one who escaped his wrath by dying in childbirth before his favor could turn cold. Henry's decaying body stood in jarring contrast to the mythologizing already underway regarding his reign. Artists like Hans Holbein had fashioned a lasting image of the king as a broad-chested titan of masculinity, feet wide apart, hands resting on hips, and eyes blazing with command. This powerful visual would endure for generations, despite bearing little resemblance to the ailing and bloated corpse entombed beneath Windsor's stones. Henry's will exposed his last attempts to steer England's future from beyond the grave. This 30-page document outlined a precise succession plan, first to Edward, followed by Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and then to Elizabeth, child of Anne Boleyn. Although briefly interrupted by the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, this succession would eventually unfold exactly as he had commanded. Henry's influence after death persisted through the reigns of all 3 of his children, each of whom would rule as Tudor monarchs until the dynasty ended with Elizabeth I's passing in 1603. More immediately impactful were the power structures Henry designed for Edward's minority. He established a council of 16 men to rule collectively until Edward came of age, aiming to prevent any single noble from gaining too much influence over his son. However, these arrangements quickly unraveled when Edward Seymour maneuvered politically to become Lord Protector just days after Henry's death. The rapid erosion of Henry's carefully laid plans revealed the inherent limits of royal power once the monarch's presence was no longer a factor. Henry's medical legacy continues to intrigue modern scholars and physicians. His varied symptoms have led to retrospective diagnoses ranging from syphilis to scurvy, though most historians now favor type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. His treatment records display increasingly desperate measures. Remedies included applying halved live pigeons to his festering wounds and administering mixtures made from gold and crushed gemstones. These lavish yet ineffective treatments highlight both the shortcomings of Tudor medicine and the extraordinary lengths taken for a king of his stature. Some of the most touching revelations came from the personal items discovered in Henry's chambers following his death. Amidst the expected symbols of monarchy, bejeweled daggers, official seals, and diplomatic papers, servants found a small locked box containing deeply personal mementos. Inside were a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair believed to belong to his mother, Elizabeth of York, and a child's handwritten prayer book, possibly once owned by Elizabeth before her mother's execution. These intimate belongings offer a rare glimpse into the man behind the monstrous legacy, suggesting that, despite his physical and mental decay, Henry retained a thread of emotional attachment to his family. The king's death prompted immediate shifts in political alignment that would influence England's path for decades. The conservative Catholic faction, which had retained considerable sway during Henry's final years, was swiftly pushed aside as Edward Seymour established a dominantly Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had delivered last rites to the dying king, moved quickly to implement religious changes that Henry had approached with more caution. Only 2 years after Henry's death, the first English Book of Common Prayer was published, pushing the country further into Protestant doctrine than Henry himself had ever envisioned. Henry's religious position, marked by his rejection of the Pope while clinging to many Catholic beliefs, left a theological ambiguity. This duality allowed both sides of the religious divide to claim Henry as their own. Protestants cited his defiance of Rome, while Catholics emphasized his belief in transubstantiation and his denunciation of Lutheran ideas. This spiritual complexity would go on to fuel deep religious tensions during the reigns of all 3 of Henry's children, as the kingdom veered from radical Protestantism under Edward to Catholic revival under Mary, and finally to Elizabeth's more moderate religious settlement. The king's passing also signaled a pivotal moment in the evolution of Tudor propaganda. Having portrayed Henry as the stalwart guardian of England against foreign threats and papal dominance, royal image makers now face the task of transferring that authority to a mere 9-year-old. Portraits of young Edward VI were deliberately styled to mimic his father's iconic posture, feet firmly apart, arms assertively placed at his sides, and a steady gaze, mirroring the defiant stance that had defined Henry's most famous depictions. Court rituals reinforced this sense of continuity, requiring courtiers to bow before Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had once shown to the formidable presence of his father. Outside the realm of politics, Henry's death resonated deeply in the everyday lives of his subjects. For almost 40 years, he had personified royal command. His character and unpredictable decisions directly influenced governance even at the most local levels. His death left not only a political void, but also a psychological one. Parish documents from early 1547 show a general unease about what lay ahead, including more frequent mentions of prophetic dreams, unusual signs in the sky, and reported ghost sightings. For a populace deeply immersed in religious imagery, the death of such a powerful ruler inevitably evoked apocalyptic fears. The international response to Henry's death highlighted England's complicated standing in European affairs. According to the French ambassador, King Francis II sincerely mourned his dear brother of England, despite their long-standing hostilities. Emperor Charles V, the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, took a more calculated view, questioning whether a realm led by a boy king might be susceptible to foreign aggression or manipulation. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry roughly 10 years earlier, reportedly had a mass said for his soul, an act of diplomacy that both acknowledged Henry's importance and reasserted the Church's spiritual claim over him. The room where Henry died, his private quarters in Whitehall Palace, quickly took on a powerful historical aura. Courtiers hesitated to enter the chambers where he had endured his final suffering, and tales of odd noises and sudden chills began circulating, heightening superstitious dread. the young Edward VI is said to have declined sleeping in his father's bed, requesting that new rooms be prepared for him. This emotional aftermath illustrates how deeply Henry's death disturbed those who had spent years catering to his erratic needs. His medical case stands as one of the most thoroughly documented royal deaths in history, offering rare insight into Tudor-era medicine. His doctors meticulously logged the treatments applied in his final months, records preserved to demonstrate that no effort was spared in trying to save the monarch. These notes show a blend of traditional Galenic theory and newer Renaissance techniques, hot cupping to draw out harmful humors, herbal concoctions based on ancient sources, and even rudimentary forms of hydrotherapy. Their failure to ease his suffering underscores the limits faced by even the best-trained healers of the time. Henry's preoccupation with his legacy extended to detailed plans for his tomb, a colossal structure intended to surpass all other royal graves in England. He commissioned intricate blueprints featuring 40 full-sized bronze statues and a massive central edifice topped with an equestrian figure of himself. This extravagant design mirrored both his enormous self-image and his concern with how posterity would view him. Ironically, the project remained incomplete due to financial limitations, and the intended bronze statues were later melted down during the English Civil War, a fate that would have outraged a monarch so obsessed with appearances. In the immediate wake of his death, individuals rushed either to align themselves with or distance themselves from Henry's memory. Former courtiers who had fallen from grace re-emerged, while those who had benefited from his favor hurried to secure new alliances. Archival letters reveal the desperation of long-serving royal staff who suddenly found themselves dismissed, their careers built around catering to the king's whims now obsolete. For many, the transition proved insurmountable. The talents required to navigate Henry's volatile moods were of little use in the more composed court of Edward VI. A number of his former confidants took their own lives in the months following his death, unable to cope with the abrupt shifts in power. Arguably most consequential, Henry's passing marked a pivotal move in English political structure, from domination by a single autocratic ruler to a more collaborative system of governance between monarch and nobility. Edward Seymour, acting as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's imposing personal authority, and thus depended more on council consent. Although this balance would temporarily revert under Mary's reign, it laid the groundwork for a restrained monarchy that would evolve under Elizabeth and contribute significantly to England's distinct constitutional development. Paradoxically, Henry's death weakened the very autocratic institution he had so aggressively fortified throughout his life. The king's final illness became a focus of continued medical analysis, with each era of physicians re-evaluating his symptoms through the lens of their own understanding. Victorian-era doctors, guided by moral interpretations of disease, speculated that syphilis was the cause, seeing his ailments as divine punishment for his sexual excesses. Early 20th century medical experts shifted attention to metabolic conditions, naming gout and diabetes as likely contributors. More recent medical historians have proposed complex diagnoses, including McLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that could explain both his physical decay and psychological symptoms, as well as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, possibly resulting from numerous jousting injuries in his youth. The disposal of Henry's personal belongings offers a vivid look into Tudor attitudes toward death and legacy. Court records detail how items touched by the king during his final days were treated with special reverence, some preserved almost as relics, despite the Protestant rejection of such veneration. His final set of nightwear, soiled with bodily fluids, was ceremonially burned under Archbishop Cranmer's supervision, an act that merged sanitary necessity with ritual meaning. Pricier items, such as his wide-ranging collection of astronomical instruments and maps, were carefully inventoried and either distributed according to his will or retained for Edward's instruction. Henry's death placed his remaining wives and children in unstable and sensitive positions, demanding strategic navigation of court dynamics. Catherine Parr, his widow, observed the formalities of mourning in public, but in private, she swiftly moved to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour, a match she had postponed while Henry lived. 9-year-old Edward, king in title but dominated by his Seymour uncles, noted his father's passing in his journal with unsettling detachment. The emperor's ambassador was commanded to come home on the 4th of January upon the death of the king, my father, whose soul got pardon. This cold entry underscored the emotional distance between father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters faced distinct challenges in the new political climate. Mary, at 31, remained deeply committed to Catholicism and grew increasingly estranged by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, only 13, had to tread carefully through the treacherous landscape of court politics. Her standing remained precarious due to her mother's execution and lingering doubts about her legitimacy. Though both women would eventually ascend to the throne, as Henry had promised, their paths would be perilous. Mary narrowly escaping execution during Wyatt's rebellion, and Elizabeth enduring imprisonment in the Tower under her sister's rule. Accounts detailing Henry's final hours highlight the profound isolation even the most powerful ruler faced in death. Though he was surrounded by doctors, attendants, and courtiers, contemporary sources suggest he met the end essentially alone, cut off by his royal station and by the deeply personal nature of dying. Archbishop Cranmer, attempting to offer spiritual solace, reportedly received little more than a final squeeze of the hand. The king, who had commanded unwavering obedience across his realm, ultimately made his last journey in solitude, a striking reminder of mortality's equalizing force. The year following Henry's death revealed just how thoroughly his personality had permeated English administration. Government records show numerous decisions had been stalled, awaiting his direct input, matters that subordinate officials might have resolved but instead deferred due to a culture of absolute deference. Under Edward's regency, this bottleneck necessitated a reorganization of state functions to operate without the monarch's direct oversight. Though chaotic at first, this shift eventually strengthened institutional governance, promoting bureaucratic processes capable of functioning independently of the king's personal involvement. Henry's elaborate funeral procession served as his final performance in England's grand theater of sovereignty. Eyewitness accounts describe horses draped in black velvet, heralds carrying symbolic arms, and a life-sized wax effigy of the king in full royal attire positioned atop his coffin, an artificial figure masking the decomposing body below. The cortege moved from London to Windsor over several days, granting thousands of subjects a final glimpse of Tudor majesty. The ceremony's meticulous staging reflected deep concern over the transition of power, using ritual to reaffirm that while a king may die, the monarchy itself endures. The royal physicians who had failed to preserve Henry's life faced uncertain prospects after his death. Medical documents indicate that some swiftly obtained posts within other noble households, while others encountered professional disgrace due to their association with the king's unsuccessful care. Dr. Thomas Wendy, notable for bravely informing Henry of his impending death when others hesitated, managed to turn that act of candor into continued royal employment under Edward VI. The apothecaries faced particularly intense scrutiny, with inventories of medicines provided during the king's final illness being reviewed for potential negligence, or, worse, intentional acceleration of his demise. The scientific investigation of Henry's remains, carried out during vault renovations in the 1800s, offered fascinating insights into his physical condition at death. Workers reportedly uncovered a massive skeleton matching Henry's known height, showing significant joint damage, especially in the legs. When combined with modern forensic analysis of historical medical records, findings suggest that Henry may have weighed close to 400 pounds at the time of his death, with a waistline exceeding 50 inches. This extreme obesity, alongside poor circulation and the persistent open leg ulcers described in contemporary accounts, likely created ideal conditions for the sepsis that contributed to his demise. Perhaps most revealing about Henry's final days is what they illustrate about the limitations of power. The monarch who had redefined England's religious identity, executed nobles and queens without remorse, and founded the navy that would later dominate the seas, found himself utterly powerless against his body's collapse. Court documents recount how Henry lashed out at his doctors, ordering them to heal him through the sheer authority of royal command. This desperate resistance to the natural course of illness highlights the central irony of absolute monarchy, that even the most exalted rulers remain helpless in the face of disease, decay, and death. The theological uncertainty surrounding Henry's death opens space for multiple, politically useful narratives. Protestant historians portrayed his final moments as spiritually clear, highlighting supposed expressions of evangelical faith. In contrast, Catholic writers abroad described a tormented king, burdened by remorse for severing ties with Rome. In truth, Henry appeared to maintain his unique religious stance to the end, seeing himself as head of the English Church while refusing core Protestant beliefs. This doctrinal ambiguity, Catholic in ritual but anti-papal in structure, mirrored Henry's lifelong tendency to shape religious institutions to fit his personal needs rather than align with any singular ideology. The financial aftermath of Henry's death reached far beyond the royal court. Treasury records show that the new regency inherited empty coffers and a currency weakened by excessive debasement, consequences of Henry's costly wars and extravagant lifestyle. Some estimates suggest he spent the modern equivalent of £200 million solely on palatial construction. This fiscal crisis compelled Edward Seymour to persist with Henry's unpopular practice of selling off monastic lands, accelerating a massive redistribution of property. The ripple effects of Henry's economic excesses fueled inflation and unrest that would plague the reigns of his successors. Henry's bodily deterioration came to symbolize a broader national malaise for many contemporary observers. Just as medieval theory envisioned the king as the head of the body politic, Tudor commentators saw his festering wounds as mirroring deeper moral and institutional decay within England. Sermons from 1547 make this connection explicit, comparing the king's infected limbs to the perceived corruption afflicting society. Reformers used this symbolism during Edward's reign to argue that, just as Henry's body required aggressive intervention, so too did England's religious life demand sweeping purification. The final phase of Henry VIII's life represents a pivotal moment where medieval and early modern concepts of monarchy overlapped. On one side were ancient rituals of royal death, concerns about succession and proper burial echoing traditions centuries old. On the other, the legal clarity of his will, the systematic preservation of medical records, and the administrative continuity after his passing reflected modern ideas of institutional governance. In this way, Henry died suspended between two worlds, the last monarch to wield genuinely medieval authority, yet also a founder of the centralized bureaucratic state that would shape England's future. What ultimately renders the death of Henry VIII so compelling is not merely the physical suffering or its far-reaching political consequences, but the profound reflection it offers on the nature of human mortality. The king who had reshaped his nation through sheer force of will ended his life confronting the same frailty that claimed all his subjects. Reports from the time suggest that Henry experienced deep existential dread in his last days, preparing to meet judgment not as a sovereign, but as a man. as Archbishop Cranmer is said to have reminded him while delivering the last rites. He was about to appear before a realm where no royal title held weight and no worldly power could shield him. In this final moment of shared vulnerability, perhaps England's most imposing monarch found the human connection that had evaded him during life.